My log has something to tell you.
This morning, we are starting a journey into a new unknown. Frontiers that leave our entities and UFOs behind for a second to pick up some real secret history. What am I talking about? I'm talking about the Devil's Chessboard, Allen Dulles, the CIA, and the rise of America's secret government. Now, on this journey, we're going to meet the real 007, learn about the start of secrecy in the Cold War, and dive into Allen Dulles' time in World War II and beyond, possibly his involvement in larger conspiracies in modern American history. A man who worked with more presidents than any other big dog, who was head of the CIA in the beginning, part of the birthing of the CIA. You could call him the father. And we're going to take a deep, in-depth, and complex look at his life throughout this book. We're going to learn all about who the granddaddy of the CIA is. And as they say, the apple does not fall far from the tree. But enough of me. Let's get into the good stuff, the reading, and the secret history of World War II through the eyes of Allen Dulles, the Spy Master King. I shall tantalize you with a quote about this book from Kirkus Reviews, a starred review. A frightening biography of power, manipulation, and outright treason. The story of Allen Dulles and the power elite that ran Washington, D.C. following World War II is the stuff of spy fiction. All engaged American citizens should read this book and have their eyes opened. Uh-oh. Chapter 1, The Double Agent. And if you want to read the book in full, pick it up, go buy it. I'm not going to read every single part. I'm going to read parts of it, the most cool parts, and some of the chapters. Like, we're not getting into the prologue or the introduction. We're going to read chapter 1. So let's get into it. The audiobook too. Check out a straight up audiobook as well. That would just read. If you're looking for that, that would just read straight up. But if you're looking for a party, you've come to the right place. Allen Dulles went to war on November 9th, 1942, crossing into neutral Switzerland from Vichy, France, just minutes before the Nazis closed the border. He later told the story of his border crossing with pulse-racing dramatic flair, but in reality, it went surprisingly smoothly, especially considering the 49-year-old Wall Street lawyer's high international profile. After presenting his passport to the French gendarme at the border station near Geneva, Dulles paced the train platform while the policeman made a phone call to Vichy authorities. Then, after a hovering Gestapo agent conveniently disappeared, the gendarme obligingly waved Dulles through. It was almost as if Dulles was expected. There was nothing undercover about Allen Dulles' wartime exploits in Switzerland. Afterward, he made much of his espionage adventures with the sympathetic press, and then equally credulous biographers dutifully repeating his beguiling tales. But, in truth, there was little daring involved. For a very simple reason. Dulles was more in step with many Nazi leaders than he was with President Roosevelt. Dulles not only enjoyed a professional and social familiarity with many members of the Third Reich's elite that predated the war, he shared many of these men's post-war goals. While serving in his Swiss outpost, Dulles might have been encircled by Nazi forces, but he was also surrounded by old friends. Ain't that how it go? After crossing the border, Dulles wasted no time settling into Bern, the scenic Swiss capital where he had begun his espionage career a quarter century earlier as a junior member of the United States legation during World War I. The medieval city, built on cliffs overlooking the glacial green Ahr River as it flowed down from the white-capped alpine peaks on the horizon, held a treasure of memories. During the earlier war, there had been embassy parties and rounds of tennis, with balls arriving in diplomatic pouches from back home, courtesy of his brother Foster. Dear Allen, I hope you enjoy these tennis balls. May they remind you of us. There was an international parade of mistresses, young secretaries from the consulates that filled the city's diplomatic quarter, as well as free-spirited women from the local art colony. He met his conquests for drinks and pleasure at the Bellevue Palace Hotel, the elegant Art Nouveau fortress that dominated the old city's skyline. Dulles affected the look of a dashing cavalry officer in those days, with a waxed mustache, slim waist jacket, and a high starched collar. One of his affairs during the First World War had a brutal ending. She was a young Czech patriot who worked alongside Dulles in the U.S. legation office. British agents concluded that she was using her position to pass information to exiled Czech leader Jan Masaryk, as well as to the Germans. When the British confronted Dulles with their suspicions, the ambitious young diplomat knew he was in an awkward spot, and he quickly complied with their plans. One night, Dulles took the woman to dinner, and afterwards he strolled with her along a cobblestone street to an agreed-upon location, where he handed her over to 2 British agents. She disappeared forever. The first of a long list of people that go disappeared when they meet Old Alan. I guess you can say, as Michael Cole would say about Randy Orton, vintage Alan Dulles. Vintage. Oh, someone disappeared? Oh, vintage Dulles. When Dulles returned to Bern in 1942 for the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, America's World War II spy agency, he set up his base of operations in his residence, the ground floor apartment of a handsomely renovated 14th century mansion at 23 Herrengasse, near the city's majestic cathedral. Dulles later insisted that he had carefully chosen the location with security in mind. Since the street ended in a cul-de-sac, he prevailed upon municipal authorities to extinguish the lamplight outside his building, giving late-night visitors a measure of anonymity as they slipped in and out. Guests seeking more confidentiality could enter Dulles' apartment from the rear, climbing an ancient flight of stone steps that rose steeply to his back terrace from grape arbors and a dark river below. But all this cloak and dagger was a bit of a charade, a charade. As soon as Dulles showed up in Bern, his arrival was reported in one of the Switzerland's leading newspapers, which announced him, to the spy's great delight, as the personal representative of President Roosevelt. This afforded Dulles a status that would be very useful as he pursued his various intrigues. Little scamp on the loose here. After arriving at his 14th century mansion on 23 Herrengasse with such great fanfare, Dulles found himself under intense scrutiny. Although the newly arrived American spy had enjoyed long friendships with many in the enemy camp, each side trusted the other only up to a point. From across the street, Nazi agents kept close watch on the Dulles residence 24 hours a day. The Germans also infiltrated his staff. His cook turned out to be a spy, and his janitor stole carbon copies of his documents out of his trash. Meanwhile, Swiss intelligence agents who worked closely with their Nazi counterparts eavesdropped on Dulles' phone conversations. There was little that was secret about the American spy's life in Bern. None of this seemed to disturb Dulles, who wandered openly through the streets of Bern in a rumpled raincoat and a fedora cocked carelessly on the back of his head. He did not have a bodyguard, and he did not carry a gun. He met openly with informers and double agents in cafes on the city streets. Too much secrecy can be self-defeating, he observed. What's really cool about this book is you get to learn about the secret, more down and dirty heroes of World War II, like this next dude, William Wild Bill Donovan, director of the OSS, originally wanted to station Dulles in London, but Dulles insisted on Bern and he prevailed. Donovan was a legend, a World War I combat hero and self-made Wall Street millionaire lawyer who had charmed FDR and outmaneuvered powerful rivals like J. Edgar Hoover to build the country's first international intelligence agency. Undaunted by Washington bureaucracy, Donovan had recruited an impressively eclectic array of talent for his new spy agency, like Archer's mom. From Ivy League adventurers and society girls to safecrackers and professional killers, But Dulle's, who moved in the same social circles as Donovan and competed aggressively with him on the tennis court, was not awed by his boss. He thought he could do a better job than Donovan of running the show. Dulle's knew that the isolated splendor of Bern would afford him free rein to operate as he chose, with only tenuous supervision from back home. Dulle's also positioned himself in Bern because the Swiss capital was the center of wartime financial and political intrigue. Bern was an espionage bazaar, teeming with spies, double agents, informers, and peddlers of secrets. And as Dulle's knew, Switzerland was a financial haven for the Nazi war machine. The Swiss demonstrated that they were masters of duplicity during the war. Banks in Zurich and Basel allowed the Nazis to stash the treasure they were looting from Europe in secret accounts, which Germany then used to buy the essential products from neutral countries that fueled the Third Reich. Tungsten from Spain, oil from Romania, steel from Sweden, beef from Argentina. Swiss bankers promised the Allies that they would block Germany's stolen assets, but all the while, they reaped huge profits from their behind-the-scenes deals with the Nazi Reichsbank. Dulle's knew many of the central players in the secretive Swiss financial milieu because he and his brother had worked with them as clients or business partners before the war. Sullivan and Cromwell, the Dulles brothers' Law Street firm, was at the center of an intricate international network of banks, investment firms, and industrial conglomerates that rebuilt Germany after World War I. Foster, the law firm's top executive, grew skilled at structuring the complex merry-go-round of transactions that funneled massive U.S. investments into German industrial giants like the IG Farben chemical conglomerate and Krupp Steel. The profits generated by these investments then flowed to France and Britain in the form of war reparations, and then back to the United States to pay off war loans. So they are embedded with the Germans in World War I and after World War I. They're like this. They make money with them. Foster Dulles became so deeply enmeshed in the lucrative revitalization of Germany that he found it difficult to separate his firm's interests from those of the rising economic and military power, even after Hitler consolidated control over the country in the 1930s. Foster continued to represent German cartels like IG Farben as they were integrated into the Nazis' growing war machine, helping the industrial giants secure access to key war materials. He donated money to America First, the campaign to keep the United States out of the gathering tempest in Europe, and helped sponsor a rally honoring Charles Lindbergh, the fair-haired aviation hero who had become enchanted by Hitler's miraculous revival of Germany. Foster refused to shut down the Berlin office of Sullivan and Cromwell, whose attorneys were forced to sign their correspondence Heil Hitler, boo, until his partners, including Allen, fearful of a public relations disaster, insisted he do so. When Foster finally gave in at an extremely tense 1935 partners meeting in the firm's lavish offices at 48 Wall Street, he broke down in tears. What? Foster still could not bring himself to cut off his former Berlin law partner, Gerhard Westrick. When he showed up in New York in August 1940 to lobby on behalf of the Third Reich, setting himself up in an opulent Westchester country estate, Westrick invited influential New York society types for weekend parties, taking the opportunity to subject them to his pro-Hitler charm offensive. Westrick's guest list were dominated by oil executives because he was particularly keen on ensuring the continued flow of fuel and supplies to Germany. Despite the British embargo, the lobbyists finally went too far, even by the hospitable standards of the New York society set, when he had the gall to throw a gala party at the Waldorf Astoria on June 26, 1940, to celebrate the Nazi defeat of France. Ooh, you son of a bitch. Westrick's shameless audacity created an uproar in the New York press, but Foster rushed to the Nazi promoter's defense, insisting he had a high regard for his integrity. Shut up, Foster. Boo. Until late in the day, Foster harbored sympathy for the devil himself, Adolf Hitler. Of course he did. Even after the Nazi regime pushed through the anti-Semitic Nuremberg laws of 1935 and unleashed waves of terror against Germany's Jewish population. Foster clung to a sympathetic view of the Fuhrer. He could not help being impressed by a man who from humble beginnings has attained an unquestioned leadership of a great nation. Foster told a friend in 1937, by 1939, Eustace Seigelman, a Jewish senior partner of Sullivan and Cromwell, had become so fed up with Foster's position on Nazi Germany that he confronted his boss, telling Foster he was hurting the firm's reputation by publicly suggesting that Germany's position was morally superior to that of the Allies. Yeah, what the Foster? Let's see. What is Alan any different? Like his brother, Alan Dulles was slow to grasp the malevolence of Hitler's regime. Dulles met face to face with Hitler in the Fuhrer's Berlin office in March 1933. He was supposedly on a fact-finding mission to Europe for President Roosevelt, but Dulles was particularly interested in determining what Hitler's rise meant for his law firm's corporate clients in Germany and the United States, aka, what's it mean for my money? As Dulles subsequently informed Foster, he did not find Hitler particularly alarming, and he was rather impressed with Joseph Goebbels, remarking on the Nazi propaganda chief's sincerity and frankness. He's a propaganda chief. He's not. After Dulles and fellow U.S. statesman Norman Davis returned to Adlon, their luxury hotel across from the Brandenburg Gate, Davis was unnerved to find the word Juden scrawled crudely on the door of his room. Even though he was not Jewish, the conditions are not quite as bad as anxious reports about Hitler would indicate, Dulles nonetheless wrote Foster from Germany. So, information is suppressed. By the late 1930s, Dulles' views finally shifted, and he came to dismiss Nazi leaders as those mad people in control of Germany. He grew increasingly certain that the United States must prepare for an inevitable showdown with Hitler. But, out of deference to Foster, Allen was reluctant to make his opinion public. He also continued to do business with his Nazi financial and industrial network, joining the board of J. Henry Schroeder Bank, the U.S. subsidiary of a London bank that Time magazine in 1939 called the economic booster of the Rome-Berlin axis. And Allen and his wife Clover continued to socialize with the Lindberghs, who were their neighbors on Long Island's Gold Coast shore. Lindbergh, enamored of Hitler, noted in his diary that he and Dulles have somewhat similar views in a number of instances. Mr. Dulles. Oh, do you? Do you too? Even after Dulles was recruited into the OSS by Donovan in October 1941, his loyalists were still questioned by some administration officials, including Roosevelt himself. Dulles' various financial connections to the Nazi regime prompted FDR to place the Wall Street lawyer under close surveillance when he began working in the OSS's 36th floor suite in Rockefeller Center. Monitoring Dulles proved an easy task since he shared office space with a massive British spy operation run by the legendary Canadian secret agent William Stevenson, who became famous as the man called Intrepid. At one point, Stevenson's Rockefeller Center operation, which was tucked away under the colorless name the British Security Coordination, grew to as many as 3,000 employees. It was a remarkably ambitious covert enterprise, particularly considering that England was operating on friendly soil. Stevenson had been sent to the United States in 1940 by his enthusiastic patron Winston Churchill, Britain's newly elected prime minister, after the evacuation of British forces from the beaches of Dunkirk. With Hitler's forces overrunning Europe and turning their gaze towards an increasingly isolated England, Churchill knew that his nation's only hope was to maneuver the United States into the war. Roosevelt was a strong supporter of the British cause, but with as much as 80% of the American public against entering the European war, and Congress equally opposed, both FDR and Churchill realized it would take a major propaganda offensive to sway the nation. The British government and the Roosevelt White House faced not only a deeply wary American public with understandable concerns about the costs of war, but a well-financed appeasement lobby with strong links to Nazi Germany. With the fate of nations at stake, the shadow war in America grew increasingly ruthless. Churchill made it clear that he was quite willing to engage in what he euphemistically called ungentlemanly warfare to save his nation, and he enjoyed Roosevelt's firm support. Go ahead and murder them all, boys. Stevenson, Britain's point man in the underground war against Nazi Germany on American soil, was a suave operator with a flair for hosting lively cocktail parties at his penthouse suite in Midtown Manhattan's Dorset Hotel. But like James Bond, the fictional spy, partly modeled on Stevenson by his colleague Ian Fleming, Stevenson was also willing to do the dirty work of espionage. The slim, slight Stevenson, who arrived in New York at the age of 44, had the springy step of the boxer he once was, and the smooth self-assurance of the self-made millionaire that he had become. He proved an adept practitioner of the black arts of espionage, working his far-flung press contacts in America to expose Nazi front companies, including some of the Dulles brothers' corporate clients, and pressuring Washington to deport Nazi lobbyists. Stevenson's operatives also undertook a variety of black bag operations, such as breaking into the Spanish embassy in Washington, where they stole the secret codes for diplomatic messages flowing between General Francisco Franco's fascist government and Berlin. Stevenson was even authorized to kill members of the Nazi network in the United States, including German agents and pro-Hitler American businessmen, using British assassination teams. One of the men considered for elimination was none other than Dulle's business partner, Gerhard Westrick. The big spending Hitler lobbyist was eventually simply deported. It was this decidedly ungentlemanly Stevenson tactic that inspired Fleming to grant his hero the license to kill, which Stevenson basically had, which is wild. Think about it. This dude had a license to kill American citizens, American businessmen, if they were aligned with Hitler during World War II. Where's that 007 movie? Years later, when James Jesus Angleton and William K. Harvey, two legends of U.S. counterintelligence, were searching for assassins to kill Cuban leader Fidel Castro, they sought the advice from a British colleague named Peter Wright. Have you thought about approaching Stevenson? Wright suggested. A lot of the old-timers say he ran this kind of thing in New York during the war. And I can't wait to get into the history of the United States going after Fidel Castro. It's like a Wile E. Coyote United States versus Roadrunner Fidel Castro, and none of our acne traps work. President Roosevelt was well aware that the Dulle'S were at the center of Wall Street and Republican Party opposition to his presidency. The brothers, as top legal advisors to America's business royalty, were the very symbols of the plutocracy that the president rallied against when giving vent to his populist passions. The fact that they were also linked to Nazi financial interests only deepened Roosevelt's suspicions, as they should. While FDR himself was adept at hiding his true political feelings behind a mask of charm, there were some New Deal loyalists who openly expressed the deep hatred between the Roosevelt and Dulles camps. One such firebrand was William O. Douglas, the progressive young lawyer President Roosevelt put in charge of the Securities and Exchange Commission, the newly formed Wall Street watchdog agency, and later appointed a justice of the Supreme Court. As FDR's top Wall Street regulator, Douglas had more than one occasion to cross swords with Foster. Years later, hatred for the quote-unquote unconscious and self-righteous senior Dulles brothers still reverberated in the New Dealer's memoir. Foster carried himself like a quote-unquote high churchman, observed Douglas, but in reality, he was the kind of predatory Wall Street shill who, for a fee, would stand for almost anything. If the John Foster Dulle'S of America were destined for heaven, as men of his ilk were always utterly certain, then Douglas would rather end up in hell. I could perhaps endure men like Foster for an evening, but to sit on a cloud with them through eternity would be to exact too great a price. Though FDR shared the Dulles crowd's privileged background, the president felt much more in tune with men like Douglas, the product of a hard-scrabble childhood in Washington's Yakima Valley, where he had grown up picking fruit to help support his family. Brilliant and hard-driven, Douglas worked his way through Columbia University Law School. One of the talented law school graduates' first job interviews was with Foster Dulles at Sullivan and Cromwell. But Foster was so pontifical that Douglas decided against joining the firm. In fact, he recalled, I was so struck by Foster's pomposity that when he helped me with my coat, as I was leaving the office, I turned and gave him a quarter tip. After joining the Roosevelt administration at the age of 35, Douglas quickly developed a reputation as a rising New Deal star, taking over as chairman of the Securities and Exchange Commission from Joseph P. Kennedy in 1937, and becoming a fixture in the president's inner circle. A frequent weekend guest at Camp Douglas, the presidential retreat that was widely known in those years as Shangri-La, Douglas solidified his position with the president by learning to perfect a dry martini, FDR's favorite cocktail. Roosevelt grew so fond of Douglas that in 1914, while pondering running mates for his fourth presidential run, he briefly considered the young SCE chairman. Douglas was an energetic New Dealer. FDR reminded a group of Democratic Party bosses who had gathered in the White House to advise him on the decision. Besides, he noted, Douglas played a stimulating game of poker, but the political bosses were not enamored of Douglas as the president. They were well aware that announcing a Roosevelt-Douglas ticket would set off a bombshell on Wall Street. While serving with the SCE, the SEC, whoops, why do I want to say SCE all the time? SEC. While serving with the SEC, Douglas had become a scourge of the financial industry. Bankers and lawyers accustomed to the hushed privacy of wood-paneled suites and private dining rooms were yanked before public hearings, presided over by Douglas and his sharp young staff, and forced to account for their business practices. Even Robert Swain of the white shoe law firm Cravath, who had once been Douglas's boss, got the full treatment. You stood me on my head and shook all the fillings out my teeth, he later told Douglas. With his craggy Western good looks and lean outdoorsman's build, Douglas seemed cut out to be a populist hero, an everyman Gary Cooper, taking on pompous big shots like the ones played by Edward Arnold in Frank Capra movies. The stuffed shirt John Foster Dulles was his perfect nemesis. Douglas once put Foster on the witness stand for 2 full days, grilling him about the fortune that he had reaped for his law firm by managing a sketchy bankruptcy procedure that had fleeced a multitude of creditors. The high and mighty Foster had squirmed on the stand like a pontiff forced to, quote-unquote, to do business with the underworld, recalled Douglas. By sicking men like William O. Douglas on men like John Foster Dulles, President Roosevelt drove the plutocracy mad. J.P. Morgan Jr. was so incensed by the class trader FDR that his servants had to cut out the president's picture from the Wall Street Times morning newspaper for fear it would spike his blood pressure. The class hatred against Roosevelt even resulted in at least 2 abortive coups against his presidency. In 1934, a group of Wall Street plotters, financed by wealthy Roosevelt enemies and Dulles clients, like the DuPonts, tried to recruit Marine war hero General Smedley Butler to lead an armed march on Washington. In 1940, newspaperman and socialite Cornelius Vanderbilt Jr., one of FDR's few friends in the New York club set, tipped off Eleanor Roosevelt to another anti-Roosevelt plot he had heard being hatched in his Fifth Avenue circles, involving tycoons as well as Army officers. If you haven't checked out Ken Burns' documentary on the Roosevelts, check it out. It's a good one. It's like I can't wait to finish it now because this is a whole. I hope this is included. The First Lady was among those who wondered about the wisdom of allowing someone like Dulles to set up spy operations in war-torn Europe, amen, where he was certain to open lines of communication to Nazi interests. But Dulles was not the only master chess player involved in this high-stakes game. FDR apparently had his own reason for allowing Dulles to establish himself in Bern. He was a dingle-dangle, said John Loftus, a former Nazi war crimes investigator for the U.S. Justice Department. The White House wanted Dulles in clear contact with his Nazi clients so they could be easily identified. Yeah, dangle him out. Everyone comes, it's like flypaper. They all get stuck. All the nasty ones get stuck to him. You know who's who. One of Dulles' most important contacts in Europe was Thomas McKittrick, an old Wall Street friend who was president of the Bank for International Settlements, BIS. BIS had been created by the world's leading central banks to administer German reparation payments after World War I. But it soon took on a life of its own, transforming itself into a pillar of the emerging global financial system. Lodged in a former hotel next to a chocolate shop in Basel, Switzerland, BIS was so secretive that nobody was permitted to peer inside its boardroom, even when it was empty. What was in there? Some sort of entity. Money. By 1940, when McKittrick arrived in Switzerland to oversee the bank, it was effectively controlled by Hitler's regime. 5 of its directors would later be charged with war crimes, including Hermann Schmitz, the CEO of IG Farben, the chemical conglomerate that became notorious for its production of Zyklon B, the gas used in Hitler's death camps, and for its extensive use of slave labor during the war. Schmitz was one of the many Dulles brothers' law clients and business associates who were involved with the BIS. It was a close-knit circle of men whose relationships smoothly weathered the storms of war. Even as his company was stockpiling poison for Hitler's exterminators, Schmitz would send cheery Christmas and birthday greetings to his American business friends. Oh, chemical business is booming over here, boys. The secretive BIS became a crucial financial partner for the Nazis. Emil Tool, vice president of Hitler's Reichsbank and close associate of McKittrick, once called BIS the Reichsbank's only foreign branch. BIS laundered hundreds of millions of dollars in Nazi gold looted from treasuries of occupied countries. Some of the gold was torn from the mouths of concentration camp victims or melted down from Jewish families' candle holders, cigarette cases, and other personal belongings. Dulles connected with McKittrick as soon as he set foot in Europe, meeting with the BIS president in Lisbon even before he reached Switzerland. McKittrick, a well-tailored, pink-cheeked man with a high domed forehead and prematurely snowy hair, later described the meeting as a happy coincidence. But both men were clearly eager to talk business. As soon as he walked into the lobby of his Lisbon hotel, the banker recalled, "Somebody grabbed me from behind and said, 'Is that you, Tom McKittrick? Well, my gosh, I've got to see you. You're the first man I wanted to see in Switzerland.'" And it was Dulles on his way over to his OSS station in Bern. The two men stayed up all night at the hotel in deep conversation until McKittrick had to leave for his 5 o'clock plane. Dulles was eager to pump McKittrick for inside information about the Reich, since the banker had good connections in Berlin. But the two men also wanted to discuss another issue that was of paramount concern to both of them: how to protect the assets of their German and American corporate clients in the tumultuous war climate. Like Dulles, McKittrick was not popular with Roosevelt, you think, and his inner circle. FDR's Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau Jr. developed a deep loathing for McKittrick, who Morgenthau's aide, Harry Dexter White, called an American bank president doing business with the Germans while our American boys are fighting the Germans. The Roosevelt administration moved to block BIS funds in the United States, but McKittrick hired Foster Dulles as legal counsel, who successfully intervened on the bank's behalf, already working against our interests during a war. Morgenthau was outraged when McKittrick made a business trip to the United States in the winter of 1942 and was warmly feted by Wall Street. Dozens of powerful financiers and industrialists, including the executives of several corporations such as General Motors and Standard Oil, that had profited handsomely from doing business with the Nazis gathered for a banquet in McKittrick's honor at New York's University Club on December 17th. Many such cases in history. Check it out. Giant Nazi rallies before we really got into it with them. Many supporters of the Nazi Party in our upper crust of society, you can say. Morgenthau tried to prevent McKittrick from returning to BIS headquarters in Switzerland on the grounds that the bank was clearly aiding the Nazi war effort. The banker later sniffed about the nasty crew in the treasury at the time. I was very suspect because I talked to Italians and I talked to Germans. And I said that they had behaved very well. And I refused to denounce them as villains of the worst sort. Alan Dulles came to McKittrick's rescue, deftly pulling the strings on the banker's behalf. And in April 1943, he finally boarded a transatlantic flight to Europe. He saved him because that other guy, Stevenson, was probably going to murder that guy if he stayed in America longer. Dulles and McKittrick continued to work closely together for the rest of the war. In the final months of the conflict, the two men collaborated against a Roosevelt operation called Project Safe Haven that sought to track down and confiscate Nazi assets that were stashed in neutral countries. Administration officials feared that by hiding their ill-gotten wealth, members of the German elite planned to bide their time after the war and would then try to regain power. Morgenthau's Treasury Department team, which spearheaded Project Safe Haven, reached out to the OSS and BIS for assistance. But Dulles and McKittrick were more inclined to protect their clients' interests. Moreover, like many in the upper echelons of the U.S. finance and national security, Dulles believed that a good number of these powerful German figures should be returned to post-war power to ensure that Germany would be a strong bulwark against the Soviet Union. And during the Cold War, he would be more intent on using Nazi loot to finance covert anti-Soviet operations than on returning it to the families of Hitler's victims. Dulles' true white whale, the red menace of communism. Dulles realized that none of his arguments against Project Safe Haven would be well received by Morgenthau. So he resorted to the time-honored methods of bureaucratic stalling and sabotage to help sink the operation, explaining in a December 1944 memo to his OSS superiors that his Bern office lacked the adequate personnel to do an effective job in this field and meet other demands. Bullshit. McKittrick demonstrated equal disdain for the project, and his lack of cooperation proved particularly damaging to the operation since BIS was the main conduit for the passage of Nazi gold. The Treasury Department kept sending sleuth hounds over to Switzerland, he complained years later. The only thing they were interested in was where was Hitler putting his money, and where Hermann Göring was putting his money, where Heinrich Himmler was putting his, and all the rest of the big boys in Germany. But I myself am convinced that those fellows were not piling up money for the future. Bullshit, little man. You know. While Alan Dulles was using his OSS post in Switzerland to protect the interests of Sullivan and Cromwell's German clients, his brother Foster was doing the same in New York. By playing an intricate corporate shell game, Foster was able to hide the U.S. assets of major German cartels like IG Farben and Merrick KGaA, the chemical and pharmaceutical giant, and protect these subsidiaries from being compensated by the federal government as alien property. Some of Foster's legal origami allowed the Nazi regime to create bottlenecks in the production of essential war materials, such as diesel fuel injection motors that the United States military needed for trucks, submarines, and airplanes. By the end of the war, many of Foster's clients were under investigation by the Justice Department's Antitrust Division, and Foster himself was under scrutiny for collaboration with the enemy. Yeah, that sounds like treason, bottlenecking production of vital diesel doodads that our beeps and bops need to do their battle. Come on now. But Foster's brother was guarding his back. From his frontline position in Europe, Allen was well placed to destroy incriminating evidence and to block any investigations that threatened the two brothers and their law firm. Shredding of captured Nazi records was a favorite tactic of Dulles, and his associates who stayed behind to help run the occupation of post-war Germany, observed Nazi hunter John Loftus, who pored through numerous war documents related to the Dulles brothers when he served as a U.S. prosecutor in the Justice Department under President Jimmy Carter, who saw a UFO. If their powerful enemy in the White House had survived the war, the Dulles brothers would likely have faced serious criminal charges for their wartime activities. Supreme Court Justice Arthur Goldberg, who, as a young lawyer, served with Allen in the OSS, later declared that both Dulle'S were guilty of treason. But, R.I.P., with Franklin Roosevelt gone from the arena, as of April 1945, there was not enough political will to challenge two imposing pillars of the American establishment. Allen was acutely aware that knowledge was power, and he would use his control of the country's rapidly expanding post-war intelligence apparatus to carefully manage the flow of information about him and his brother, positioning himself to secret power. FDR announced the Allied doctrine of unconditional surrender at the Casablanca Conference with British Prime Minister Winston Churchill in January 1943. The alliance's third major leader, Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin, was unable to attend the conference because he was still contending with the horrific Nazi siege of Stalingrad. The Red Army would finally prevail at the Battle of Stalingrad, and the epic victory shifted the war's momentum against the Third Reich. But the costs were monumental. The Soviet Union lost over 1 million soldiers during the struggle for Stalingrad, more than the United States would lose during the entire war. The Casablanca Conference, held January 12th through 23rd, 1943, at a barbed wire encircled hotel in Morocco, would sorely aggrieve the missing Russian leader by concluding that it was too soon to open a second major front in France. But Roosevelt's unconditional surrender declaration, which took Churchill by surprise, was FDR's way of reassuring Stalin that Americans and British would not sell out the Soviet Union by cutting a separate peace deal with Nazi leaders. Well, we'll see what Allen does with that. The Casablanca Conference was a major turning point in the war, sealing the fate of Hitler and his inner circle. As Roosevelt told the American people in a radio address following the conference, by taking an uncompromising stand against the Third Reich, the Allies made clear that they would not allow Hitler's regime to divide the anti-fascist alliance or escape justice for its monumental crimes. In our uncompromising policy, Roosevelt said, we mean no harm to the common people of the Axis nations, but we do mean to impose punishment and retribution in full upon their guilty barbaric leaders. With his close ties to Germany's upper echelons, Dulles considered the unconditional surrender declaration a disaster and was quick to let his Nazi contacts know what he thought about it. Shortly after the Casablanca Conference, Dulles sat down one wintry evening with an agent of SS leader Heinrich Himmler, an oily Mittel European aristocrat who had flitted in and out of Dulles' social circle for many years. Dulles received his guest, who was known as the Nazi Prince, at his 14th century castle, 23 Herrengrass, treating him to good scotch in a drawing room warmed by a fire. The Casablanca Declaration had clearly unnerved Himmler's circle by making it clear that there would be no escape for the Reich's barbaric leaders. But Dulles took pains to put his guest's mind at rest. The Allies' declaration, Dulles assured him, was merely a piece of paper to be scrapped without further ado if Germany would sue for peace. Treason. Thus began Allen Dulles' reign of treason as America's top spy in Nazi-occupied Europe. Maximilian Egon von Hohenlohe, the Nazi prince, was a creature of Europe's war-ravaged landed aristocracy. Prince Max and his wife, a Basque Marquesa, had once presided over an empire of property stretching from Bohemia to Mexico. But 2 world wars, global economic collapse, had stripped Hohenlohe of his holdings and reduced him to playing the role of Nazi courier. The prince had first met Dulles in Vienna in 1916, when they were both young men trying to make a name for themselves in diplomatic circles. During the 1930s, after he fell into the less refined company of the SS thugs who had taken over Germany, Hohenlohe popped up as an occasional guest of Allen and Clover in New York. Hohenlohe was just one more member of the titled set who saw advantages to Hitler's rise, and was quite willing to overlook its unpleasant side. which the prince explained away as rank-and-file Nazi party excesses that would be inevitably sorted out. The Hohenlohe family was filled with ardent Nazi admirers. Perhaps the most bizarre was Stephanie von Hohenlohe, who became known as Hitler's princess. A Jew by birth, Stephanie found social position by marrying another Hohenlohe. In the years before the war, she became one of Hitler's most tireless promoters, helping to bring British press magnate Lord Rothermere into the Nazi fold. Stephanie took Hitler's handsome, square-jawed adjutant, Fritz Weidenmann, as a lover, and laid big plans for their rise to the top of Nazi hierarchy. But it was not to be. Jealous of her favored position with Hitler, SS rivals plotted against her, spreading stories about her Jewish origins. Her aunt died in a concentration camp, and Stephanie was forced to flee Germany. But Prince Max suffered no such fall from grace. He roamed Europe, feeling out British and American diplomats on a possible deal that would sacrifice Hitler but salvage the Reich. Wherever he went, Hohenlohe got a brusque reception. British Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden warned against even speaking with the prince. If news of such a meeting became public, the damage would far exceed the value of anything the prince could possibly say. American diplomats in Madrid, who were also approached by Hohenlohe, dismissed him as a flagrant liar and totally unscrupulous. A schemer whose overriding concern was to protect his considerable fortune. And Dulle'S was like, hey, you're my kind of guy. Dulle'S brushed aside these concerns. He had no compunctions about meeting with his old friend. The truth is, he felt perfectly at ease in the company of such people. Before the war, Dulle'S had been an occasional guest of Lord and Lady Astor of Cliveden, the posh couple's country home along the Thames that became notorious as a weekend retreat for the pro-Nazi aristocracy. There was no getting around this unwelcome fact. Hitler was much more fashionable in social settings that men like Dulle'S frequented in England as well as the United States than it is later comfortable to admit. I know so much of that in our history. Royale Tyler, the go-between who set up the Bern reunion between Dulle'S and Hohenlohe, was cut from similar cloth. Born into Boston wealth, Tyler traipsed around Europe for most of his life, collecting Byzantine art, marrying a Florentine contessa, and playing the market. The multilingual Tyler and his titled wife led a richly cultured life, with Tyler haunting antique shops and private collections in search of Byzantine treasures, and restoring a chateau in Burgundy, where he showed off his rare books and art. Traveling with Tyler, noted London OSS chief David Bruce, is like taking a witty, urbane Baedeker as a courier. The Contessa, who was equally sophisticated, moved in artistic and literary circles. She was at the bedside of Edith Wharton in 1937 when the novelist expired at her villa outside Paris. So it's like equally with the 007 guy existing and Wild Bill Donovan on the Allies side, also being suave spies. These are the same people on the opposite side, right? Just very interesting. We learn about very interesting good guys and bad guys throughout history in this book. That's what I love. The most like wild characters. Like Wild Bill, the Nazi Prince, 007, the Royale Tyler dude. All psychos in their own way. Tyler was another one of those refined men who glided smoothly across borders and did not think twice about doing business with Nazi luminaries. During the war, he moved to Geneva to dabble in banking for the Bank of International Settlements, BIS. Tyler's virulent anti-Semitism made him a congenial colleague when the Reich had business to conduct in Switzerland. Well connected in the enemy camp, Tyler was among the first people who Dulle'S sought out after arriving in Switzerland. Now Dulle'S and Hohenlohe and their mutual friend Royale Tyler were gathered amicably around the OSS man's fireplace in his 14th century mansion. Dulle'S broke the ice by recalling old times with Prince Max in Vienna and New York. The men quickly got down to business, trying to determine whether a real politic deal could be struck between Germany and the United States that would take Hitler out of the equation but leave the Reich largely intact. As they spun out their visions of a post-war Europe, there was much common ground. Dulles and Hohenlohe clearly saw the Soviet Union as the enemy, with a strong Germany as a bastion against the Bolshevik and Slavic menace. The two old friends also agreed that there was probably no room for Jewish people in post-war Europe, and certainly they should not return to positions of power. Dulles offered that there were some in America who felt the Jews should be resettled in Africa, an old dream of Hitler's. The Fuhrer had once fantasized about sending the pariah population to Madagascar. Oh, Jesus, the fucking three pieces of shit just sitting around talking about their dreams. The two men were too worldly to engage in any emotional discussion about the Holocaust. Yeah. Dulles put the prince at ease by telling him that he was fed up with hearing from all the outdated politicians, immigrants, and prejudiced Jewish people. He firmly believed that a peace had to be made in Europe in which all the parties would be interested. We cannot allow it to be a peace based on a policy of winners and losers. So the exact opposite of what FDR just said about unconditional surrender, punishing people, giving retribution for these awful, horrible war crimes that were committed. Dulles is like, don't worry about it. I got you. You don't got to worry about the rules. You're my buddy. Instead of Roosevelt's unconditional surrender, in which the Nazi leadership would be held accountable for their crimes against humanity, Dulles was proposing a kind of no-fault surrender. It was a stunningly cynical and insubordinate gambit. The pact that Dulles envisioned not only dismissed the genocide against the Jews as an irrelevant issue, but it also rejected the president's firmly stated policy against secret deal-making with the enemy. Yeah, that should be a policy we don't even need to state. No secret deal-making with the enemy. The man in the White House clinging to his anti-Nazi principles was clearly one of those outdated politicians in Dulles' mind. While boldly undermining his president, Dulles had the nerve to assure Hohenlohe that he had FDR's complete support. See, double trouble agent. You can't trust him either way. Neither side should trust this dude. Slimy. Let me do that over. The fireplace meeting was in fact a double betrayal. Dulles' of President Roosevelt and the Nazi princes of Adolf Hitler. Hovering over this whole secret betrayal at 23 Herrengasse was the presence of Heinrich Himmler. He was the Reich's second most powerful man, and he dared to think he could become number one. With his weak chin, caterpillar mustache, and beady eyes gazing out from behind wire-rimmed glasses, Himmler looked less like an icon of the master race than an officious bank clerk. The former chicken farmer and fertilizer salesman, poop salesman, inflated himself by claiming noble heritage. He comes from a long line of poop salesmen, great and many, and was given to explorations of the occult and other flights of fancy. Yeah, very cool. Well, terrifying. Cool as an interesting history. They searched for the Holy Grail. They searched for immortality. All sorts of interesting stuff. The SS was very into scary, dark rituals. But Himmler was a steely opportunist, and he ruthlessly outmaneuvered his rivals, rising to become Hitler's indispensable deputy and the top security chief for the Nazi Empire. It was Himmler whom the Fuhrer had entrusted with the final solution, their breathtaking plan to wipe the Jewish people from the face of the earth. It was Himmler who had the nerve to justify this plan, standing before his SS generals in October 1943 and assuring them that they had the quote-unquote, the moral right to destroy this people which wanted to destroy us, to pile up their corpses side by side in monuments to the Reich's power. As Hannah Arendt later observed, Himmler was the Nazi leader most gifted at solving the problems of conscience that sometimes nagged the Reich's executioners. With winged words, as his diligent administrator of death, Adolf Eichmann, put it, Himmler transformed his men's gruesome work into a grand and secret mission that only the SS elite were capable of fulfilling. The order to solve the Jewish question, this was the most frightening an organization could ever receive, Hitler told the leaders of his killing teams. He knew how to appeal to his men's sense of valor and vanity, telling them to have stuck it out and, apart from exceptions caused by human weakness, to have remained decent. That is what has made us hard. This is a page of glory in our history which has never been written and is never to be written. Fucker, master manipulator. Nasty. Those rituals probably just to manipulate you further, make you think it's all good. Nasty little chicken poop seller. And in the end, it was Himmler who, despite his long enchantment with the Hitler cult, had the brass to consider replacing his Führer when he realized the war could not be won militarily. Prince Max was only one of the emissaries Himmler dispatched across Europe to seek a separate peace deal with the United States and England. At one point, Himmler even recruited fashion designer Coco Chanel, bringing her to Berlin to discuss the strategy. Interesting, Coco. Interesting, Chanel. Is that on your guys' website? Himmler knew he was playing a very dangerous game, letting Hitler know just enough about his various peace feelers, but not enough to arouse suspicion. Dulles, too, understood that he was playing with fire by defying presidential orders. After receiving a warning from Washington about the perils of fraternizing with Hohenlohe, Dulles sent back a cagey reply, cabling that he realized the prince was a tough customer and extreme caution was required, but might prove useful. Dulles did not find it necessary to inform his superiors how deeply involved he was with Himmler's envoy. Dulles and Tyler met with Hohenlohe on several other occasions over the next few weeks, from February into April, and even as late as November 1943. Dulles continued to forward Washington Prince Max's reports on Hitler's frame of mind. Who gives a fuck? Dulles regarded the prince as a serious enough collaborator to give him a secret OSS code number, 515. In the end, Dulles' machinations with Hohenlohe went nowhere. President Roosevelt was very much in control of the U.S. government, and his uncompromising position on Nazi capitulation was still firmly in place. When OSS Chief Wild Bill Donovan informed the president about the Himmler peace initiatives, FDR made it clear that he remained adamantly opposed to cutting any deals with the Nazi high command. As long as that was presidential policy, there was nothing Dulles could do but bide his time and maintain his secret lines to the enemy. But we know that's also not totally true, because we took over a bunch of Nazi scientists and administrators and we let them meld into our current government, into helping us set up the CIA, into helping us set up NASA, all over the place. Despite Heinrich, these fucking German names, dude, I swear. Be named John Smith, damn you. Despite Heinrich Himmler's elusive quest to cut a deal with the Allies, he never lost faith in Dulles. On May 10th, 1945, just days after the war ended, Himmler set out from northern Germany with an entourage of SS faithful, heading south towards Switzerland, and the protection of the American agent, Dulles. He was disguised in a threadbare blue raincoat and wore a patch over one eye, with his trademark wire rims stashed in his pocket. But Himmler never made it to the rendezvous, thank goodness. The rendezvous with Dulles. The SS chief and his retinue were captured by British soldiers as they prepared to cross the Ost River. While in custody, Himmler cheated the hangman by biting down on a glass capsule of cyanide. Coward. Even if Himmler had made it to Switzerland, however, he would not have found sanctuary. He was too prominent a face of Nazi horror for even Dulles to salvage. But the American spy would come to the rescue of many other Nazi outlaws from justice. And we're going to learn all about those outlaws in the next chapter, Human Smoke, which is how Dulles operated. And we're going to learn a little bit about his personal life. We're going to get personal and get dirty, a little gossipy, unfortunately. We're going to learn about maybe why is this guy able to sell his girlfriend out and disappear her, knowing damn well probably what happened, and just move on like nothing and use it as a power play. We're going to learn a little bit about him next time you join me, and more of the secret history of World War II and how a lot of very powerful businessmen stopped the United States from entering the war by just giving us fake, and a lot of bureaucrats. We're going to learn more about evil bureaucrats in the next chapter. So check out that should be on the tubes eventually. When I get around to it. But thank you for joining me. That's your book club. Have a great rest of your week, day, whatever it is. Ta-ta.